Let's begin now. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Chodesh Tov and Shavua Tov. This is our weekly Sunday night lecture series, and we hope that everyone is healthy and safe and well. And as we say each week, if you need anything from our community, please do not hesitate to reach out to the synagogue staff. We are here to serve you and to uplift your lives to the best of our ability. So please don't hesitate to reach out if we could be of any help. In honor of Yom HaAtzmaut this week, we have a very special speaker, and we're all so proud of our younger country, the accomplishments of our young country. I'm sure many of us have seen the reports that Israel ranks in the lead, if not in the top, in the top handful for sure, in dealing with the virus, in their strategy and how they're handling it, and in their care they're giving their citizens. So we're all immensely proud of the country's accomplishments. Our speaker today, Ambassador Ido Aharoni, currently serves as a Global Distinguished Professor for International Relations at NYU's Graduate School of Arts and Science. Ambassador Aharoni has extensive diplomatic experience with a focus on developing Israel's worldwide image and brand. He is a public diplomacy specialist. He is a 25-year veteran of Israel's Foreign Service and has worked in a variety of capacities, such as policy assistant and senior advisor. He is Israel's longest-serving consul general in New York to date. He held the position with the rank of ambassador for 6 years, from 2010 to 2016. He's overseeing the operations of Israel's largest diplomatic mission worldwide during those years. In general, Ambassador Aharoni has spent his adult life trying to improve the positioning of the state of Israel in relation to the world, to convey Israel's message, to cultivate ties with communities all over the world, both Jewish and non-Jewish. He is a strong believer that Israel should not be defined by its problems, but rather by its merits. It is a great honor to have Ambassador Aharoni address us in honor of Yom HaAtzmaut. His topic this evening, or for him, is early in the morning. Everyone should appreciate that it is 5 a.m. in Israel. So either he woke up really early or he did not go to sleep yet. So we are very grateful for your time. His topic this evening is Israel at 72, Threats and Opportunities. He'll give a presentation, and afterwards there'll be an opportunity for questions.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. And I really would like to thank you and the community for having me. It's a real honor. And a little correction here, it's 3 a.m., not 5 a.m. By the time we'll be done, it's going to be 4 a.m. I'll have another cup of coffee and I'll start my day. So I had a little early wake up, but it's a real honor to do that for a community that I know personally that cares so much about the state of Israel. So first of all, greetings to all of you from Jerusalem. And just a word about COVID-19 here in Israel. What it turns out is that, as expected, global travel is the #1 agent of COVID-19. That's why New York very quickly became the epicenter of the pandemic because of the fact that it's the gateway to America. And much to our surprise, places that are very vulnerable and susceptible, like, for example, refugee camps in the Middle East, were not hit hard. And the answer why they weren't hit hard is because they were not frequented by visitors. And so I think one of the reasons Israel is coping well with the COVID-19 crisis is because Israel is not a big, unfortunately, not a big international destination for travelers, especially not for travelers from Asia. We do see a growth in the number of tourists coming from Asia, but not enough to turn Israel into a massive epicenter like happened in northern Italy or in Spain. Spain is the second largest tourism magnet in Europe with about 70 million tourists a year, second only to France with about 80 million tourists a year. So we're looking at Israel with less than 5 million tourists a year. So that's one of the reasons the pandemic is under control. The second, of course, is the swift reaction of the government that took the harshest measures early on. And so we are well on our way to the flattened curve that everybody's talking about. And so the government decided before the weekend to ease the restrictions. And so essential businesses are open now. Schools are not open now, but I was out the other day. The roads are, full with cars, people driving around. But I have to tell you, the new abnormal is going to be based on remote working, remote learning, remote businesses, and there's no doubt in my mind that this will give boost also to this part of the economy that we call gig economy, freelance economy that is characterized by very high mobility, and also um, economies and societies will be measured by their ability to be flexible and cope with the next big pandemic that undoubtedly will come one day. I'd like to think of COVID-19 as the dress rehearsal for the real thing. So that's it about how Israel is dealing with COVID-19. I'm still, although I'm no longer in official capacity, I'm still involved very much in discussions with the Israeli government how to reopen the tourism market. And I'm part of this small group that is helping the Director General with some strategy. And our recommendation was to start with domestic tourism first, working under the assumption that the airlines will not be able to resume full capacity in the foreseeable future, simply because there is no vaccine as of yet. And the best case scenario is to talk about vaccine, within a year or even more. So, so then what we're going to do with the travel industry, obviously the answer is rely on domestic tourism, which is actually a very big part of Israeli economy. To those of you who don't know, tourism is the single largest industry in Israel, employing 1.2 million people. So a lot of people talk about Israeli high tech, but the truth is that 1.2 million people supporting nearly 3 million Israelis represent the largest segment within Israeli economy. So Israel at 72, you have to be, you have to be a firm believer in miracles when you look at what this country was able to achieve in 72 years. What I would like to do today is really very briefly touch upon the pillars of Israel's success. We'll talk about the challenges Israel is facing, but to spend a few words about each and every one of them. These are really interesting times. So the first thing that has to be said, we're approaching Yom HaZikaron. And interestingly, when you look at the count of how many people died so that Israel will be able to flourish and prosper and be independent, and so that you in New York will be able to celebrate our independence here in Israel, you notice a very interesting fact that the Israeli Ministry of Defense, which is the commander of the army, I don't know if you know that, but by law in Israel, the army is under the Ministry of Defense, and the commander-in-chief, so to speak, in Israel is the entire cabinet, which is a big difference from the American system, whereas in your case, in the United States, the commander-in-chief is the president. So it says that the count begins in 1860. What happened in 1860? And why 1860? David Ben-Gurion gives an explanation. If you haven't seen the movie about Ben-Gurion that came out about 3 years ago, you have to see it. It's based on footage that was never seen before from 1968 of an interview he gave to BBC television in London, and they for documentary that never happened. And there he explains that as far as he is concerned, the real practice of Zionism started when the Jews came out of the old city and built the first neighborhood outside of the old city, because there was always Jews in the old city. But the first time they came out of the old city, 1860, was when Sir Moses Montefiore built Yemin Moshe. Many of you know Yemin Moshe very well. It's the first neighborhood. And it was in 1860. That's when the friction between Jews and Arabs started. The second neighborhood, by the way, was built by the Jews of Bukhara. My family, Aronov, was one of 40 families that came in 1872 and built the Bukharian neighborhood, which is not far from Mea Shearim today. So the 1860 until today, approximately 25,000 people died. In historical terms, the number of people that died on both sides in 150 years of conflict is around 100,000. And when you look at what's happening only in Syria alone, in the past 7 years, 500,000 people dying, 2.1 million refugees. The numbers are staggering, yet the world is preoccupied with the Israeli-Arab/Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so in your very generous introductory remarks, Rabbi, you mentioned the work that I did. And the principle is very basic, and I'm sure that many of you will be able to relate to it, even on a personal level. No person, no organization, no community, no city, no nation would like to be solely known for its problems. And that's what happened to us. And unfortunately, it happened to us very much because of our own doing, because Zionism was based from day one. When you look at the early efforts of Theodor Herzl and Chaim Weizmann, was based on the need to advocate on our behalf, right? To make a legal and political argument, a logical argument. And it turns out that it doesn't necessarily predict people's behavior. What we discovered through our research is that many people agree with our position, but they're not attracted to what we represent. So a lot of people like Fauda, but that doesn't mean that they're going to travel to Israel. On the contrary, they watch Fauda on Netflix, they admire Israeli resilience and Israeli creativity, but that doesn't predict anything. That doesn't mean they're going to invest money in Israel. That doesn't mean they're going to travel to Israel. And so the disconnect bothered us, and we started looking at it after 9/11. And what we came up with is going back to basics, the basics of marketing, and we discovered that we own a beautiful thing called Jewish creativity. And that creativity is represented by a wide variety of people, from Albert Einstein all the way to Drake. And there's a need on our behalf to celebrate the creativity of our people in Israel and outside of Israel. And that's essentially the whole effort. So when you look at the humble beginnings, 1860, 1909, the establishment of HaShomer, 1920, the establishment of the Haganah. The Haganah, by the way, those of you who don't know, was established by the trade union. Why was it established by the trade union? The same year, the trade union was established in 1920, and one of the first things that the trade union did, built the Haganah, because security, education, and health, which were the three basic functions of the trade union, were provided for the workers. That was the way to bypass the British mandate. And that was indeed the first platform of governance that the Yeshuv, that the organized Jewish community in then Palestine built, was the trade union. Everything was created by the trade union. That's why Israel's economic fundamentals until this very day are very much restricted, and there's a very, very complicated set of rules, and compliance in Israel is very difficult, as you know, those of you who do business with Israel. That's the legacy of those days of the 1920s. So the Haganah was established in 1920. The Hebrew University opened in 1925. Technion opened in 1926. And then when Ben Gurion becomes the head of the Jewish Agency, and when the illegal immigration begins, and then 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, the asymmetry between Israel and its neighbors was striking. We were a military force of about 50,000 men and women. On the other side, there were about 100,000 if you combine all the 6 armies of the neighboring countries, including some contingency forces that came from Iraq and even Saudi Arabia. And the picture looked very, very grim. Today, I don't have to tell you, Israel is looking at perhaps the most incredible success story in the history of geopolitics. Let me explain. So the young state of Israel, which in historical terms, 72 years is nothing, has unprecedented relationships with the United States that is still the largest economy in the world, the most influential superpower in the world. We have unprecedented degree of intimacy in our relationship with Russia, with China, never had it before, with Brazil, and with India. Add to that, unprecedented intimacy in the relationships with Brazil and Nigeria, 2 major forces, one in Africa, one in Latin America. And add to that the traditional strong relationships that Israel had with Germany and now with Australia as well, and you get an unprecedented geopolitical picture. In other words, Israel has never been more accepted politically, diplomatically. When you look at the main hurdles of Israeli diplomacy, i.e., the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's pretty much off the table. And the reason it's off the table is very simple. The reason it's off the table is because of the doings of the Palestinians themselves. Let me explain. In the last 20 years, the Palestinians turned down 3 golden opportunities to achieve what they claim that is their goal, which is political independence. The first opportunity was when they rejected the Clinton plan in Camp David in the summer of 2000. The second opportunity was when they rejected de facto the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza under Ariel Sharon in the summer of 2005. And the third opportunity was when they rejected Ehud Olmert's plan in 2008. The Israelis as a whole, that prior to 2000, supported the notion of territorial compromise, the idea that there's a bargain between us and the Palestinians. We'll give them land, they'll give us safety and security. Those Israelis gradually, as a result of those 3 events, lost faith, not in Israel's capabilities, they lost faith in the desire and the willingness of the other side to strike out a deal. And as a result, the entire political camp, which was at one time the ruling camp in Israel, this is a major political earthquake. The entire camp, based on the notion of political and territorial compromise with the Palestinians, as a result of those 3 events, gradually was destroyed. So when a lot of people asking what happened to the Israeli political left, that's what happened. The Palestinians, that's what happened to them. The Palestinians were offered 3 times the deal. The last time when Olmert offered, according to Condoleezza Rice, 100% of the territory. And yet it wasn't good enough for them. Then even the most optimistic, progressive, liberal Israelis looked at it and say, wait a second, there's something wrong in this picture. There's something wrong in this picture, in this intransigence on the part of the Palestinians, unwillingness to seek compromise, and especially in a country like the United States, where your entire national ethos is based on the need to achieve compromise, the idea that if you're willing to work hard and be honest and decent, then the sky's the limit. And all of a sudden, it's very hard for Israelis to come to terms with the fact that the Palestinians reject every opportunity to achieve supposedly what they claim is their goal. So many Israelis look at it today and say, wait a second, maybe the issue is not territorial. Maybe the issue is existential. Maybe the unfinished business here is not 1967, but rather 1948. Maybe what bothers them is our very existence rather than the fact that don't have the territories. So that's how we ended up where we are today. And so, so it's a combination of a changing world, the fact that the world is looking at Israel, and I get a lot of credit for it, but I don't deserve any of it. Really, technology deserves the big credit. All of a sudden, since 2007, when this first smartphone was presented, the monopoly that was in the hands of the people that mediated Israel to the world, namely the political leadership, the pundits, the commentators, the journalists, and so on, the Tom Friedmans of the world, those people that communicated Israel to the world, the monopoly on that communications was taken away from them. And from 2007 and on, gradually, every day, more and more Israelis became brand ambassadors of their own country. And as a result, what you have is a sharp growth in tourism. Let me give you an example so that you'll understand what I'm talking about. In 2014, Israel experienced the longest war in its history, believe it or not. The war in Gaza in July, August of 2014 was the longest war, 52 days of intense fighting. And there was the conventional wisdom in the Israeli government at the time was, and I remember that I came to speak at Fifth Avenue Synagogue then. I think Naftali Bennett came to speak. He was a minister of education, and I was there on the Shabbat dinner with Ira Rennert and Inga. And the Israeli government was convinced that this is going to be a complete devastation of the tourism industry. And I remember even Uzi Landau came to New York. We had a discussion about the emergency steps that we're going to take to save the tourism and so on. And I told Uzi Landau that I have a friend who has a search capabilities, and he can actually look at the conversation online and give you a description of what is it that people are talking about all over the world, based on keywords. And so we did the search. This is in the middle of the war. This is about 2 weeks into the war. And what we discovered was something very, very interesting. Other than pockets, apparently, of people like yourselves, Jewish people who passionately care about Israel, or maybe Christian people, other than people that really follow Israel very, very closely, no one was following what was happening in Gaza worldwide. So in other words, it was not on the agenda of most people. In other words, most people had no idea that there was any war going on in Gaza. And indeed, when we looked at the cancellations, who was canceling in August for December, we discovered it was mostly organized Jewish groups. And when we looked at who wasn't canceling, it was groups of tourists that came from places that Israel was not necessarily in their news feed. For example, from the Ukraine, from Russia, from South Korea, from Nigeria, and from Brazil. And these are all, by the way, places where we've seen growth over the years. So 2007, believe it or not, the introduction of the first smartphone, iPhone, the introduction of the first smartphone created the first personal, individually designed echo chamber. That was the biggest change in Israel's image and the way Israel communicates itself to the world, because today, Israel is being communicated by each and every one of us. Every person who loves Israel, who cares about Israel, is able to produce content about Israel. We all become brand ambassadors for Israel. And let me tell you, it's only good stuff. It's only good thing for Israel. And that's the reason why we've had 7 consecutive record-breaking years in incoming tourism until 2020 because of COVID-19. That was stopped, but obviously Israel is no exception. So on the geopolitical side, we see a major success stories. What are the threats that we're facing geopolitically? We're looking at 2 major threats, and that won't change in the foreseeable future. The first threat is Iran. Iran is a threat because of several reasons, but the main reason is simply because Iran is too big for us to handle. Iran is too big, it's too sophisticated, its nuclear program is buried deep underground. In many ways, we can't really handle the issue of Iran by ourselves. And so we need an international coalition to handle the issue of Iran. And our job really, and here I have a slightly different take on what we need to do with Iran. Our job is to build a united front against Iran. This is the job of Israel, because at the end of the day, when you look at the history of Iran's nuclear program, when you look at the history of Iran itself, you know that Israel, yes, is a major consideration for them, but Israel is not their main motivation. Their main motivation stems from the fact that Iran sees itself as a fragile country surrounded by hostile nations. Of the 1.3 billion Muslims, they're only 15% Shiites. Most of them live in Iran. About 70% of them live in Iran. So Iran is the epicenter of Shiite Islam, and they see themselves, unlike what we think, they see themselves as a fragile, vulnerable country seeking for regional hegemony for historical reasons. Their biggest issue, obviously, is Sunni Islam and not Israel, not even the United States. And what you're seeing in the Middle East, the one thing that really explains everything that you see in the Middle East, and I didn't even say a word about the disintegration of 6 of the 23 members of the Arab League. What you see here is still a result and manifestation and reflection of a 1,400-year-old rift between Shiites and Sunnis. And I can talk about that. I can give you a whole presentation about that, but this is really not. So that's the first big challenge, Iran's nuclear ambitions. Unfortunately, I don't think that it's for Israel to handle by itself. The job of Israel here is to make sure that the international community is in sync. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened for a variety of reasons, but maybe it will happen in the future. The second problem, of course, is the motivation of the various terrorist groups in the region. While they can disrupt normalcy in Israel in a very big way, we always have to remember that whatever Hezbollah can do with its 120 however, there is a very strong deterrent against them. Israel's harsh reaction in June of 2006, I think, serves as a painful reminder to Hezbollah of what Israel is capable of doing. And so far that deterrence is working, and let's hope that it will continue to work in the foreseeable future. The story of immigration, Ben Gurion famously said that when we will reach the point, which he obviously thought that it was impossible to do, of 5 million people, 5 million Jews in the state of Israel, then Israel will become an irreversible fact. And obviously today, we're over 7 million Jews in the state of Israel. And a lot of people don't have that historical perspective, and it's very important to put it on the table. When the state of Israel was founded, Ben Gurion famously said, we went from a situation we were a people without a state, now we are a state without a people. What did he mean by that? That the state was empty. There was 550,000 Jews, many of them were newcomers from Europe, barely spoke the language. Many of them were survivors. And now we won the war. We have a state. By the way, scores of new Israelis post 48 left the country. I don't know if you know that, but between 48 to 53, proportionately, the largest wave of people that left Israel in Israel's history. A lot of people don't speak about that chapter, but many of the people that you know left Israel between 48 to 53. And they settled in America, in Australia, in South Africa, in England, in Latin America. So the situation in Israel was very bad. Israel had no natural resources, had no money. Israel had basically nothing to offer. So yeah, we won the war, but we had no people. And worse than that, because of the war, the condition of the Jews in the Arab countries, in the Arab world, and remember, the Arab League was the umbrella organization to 23 Arab nations. So everything that happened here affected the Jews that lived in any Arab country. And they were gradually more and more harassed by their own authorities, or simply, like in the case of Morocco, they did not feel comfortable anymore staying there. And so the young state of Israel, and the state of Israel could not have done it without the help of American Jewry, because we did not have any institutional help other than American Jewry, and to a lesser degree, British and South African Jewry. But American Jewry was the main foundation, really, of money and help. Even the tents that were used to put the new immigrants that came from Iraq and Iran and Morocco and Tunisia and Egypt, those were military, US military surplus tents that were bought by American Jews and donated to the Israeli government. A lot of people don't know that, the ma'abarot, that was money raised by American Jewry. And so the task, the monumental task of doubling and tripling the population of the young state between 52 and 58, the young state of Israel absorbed nearly 1.2 million immigrants. You see a picture here of immigrants arriving, 1.2 million immigrants, mostly from Arab countries, that came with no assets, with no money, and there was a need to provide them with housing, with education, with health, and with physical safety. And until this very day, this was, as you can imagine, this was not an easy process. The newcomers felt the humiliation and so on. Those who absorbed them felt the greatness of the moment. They thought that they were doing something great. By the way, 3 ministers in Israeli government during those years died of heart attack. And it shows you, the Minister of Health, it shows you that this was it took a huge toll also on the people that absorbed the new immigrants. Today, the new immigrants only remember the humiliation that came with, putting them up in camps and tents and so on. The crisis of moving a family, a functioning family, from its home in Morocco or in Baghdad to a tent. The father of the family is losing the source of his livelihood. The children don't find themselves. They need to learn a new language to adapt to a new society. All of a sudden, they have to go to the army. These are all major shocks to any family. And immigration is a big shock no matter where you are on the planet. And so, but when you look at it from a historical perspective, it was a huge success story. Because today, Israel is 9 million people, as I said before, a bit over 7 million Jews. Unprecedented. Zionism has never been stronger. I know that we all talk about Israel's detractors, the BDSers and so on, the delegitimizers of Israel. But the truth is that Zionism has never been stronger. We have to face it. When you look at the history of Jews, between 1850 and 1924, nearly 2.3 million Jews moved from Eastern Europe to North America, US, and Canada. And the main reason why they did that was anti-Semitism, the pogroms, and most importantly, the poverty. But during that time, when 2.3 million people came to America, and it stopped only by the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924 and 1925, only 80,000 Jews came to Palestine. And this is a very strong indication that Zionism was not a big hit. And in fact, the biggest criticism of Zionism came from Jews. And the biggest opposition to Zionism was Jewish in the first place. And Zionism was not a success story. That's why Ben-Gurion said, we were a people without a country, now we're a country without a people. And the first thing is to bring in the immigrants, even if we don't have money, which is, by the way, the secret to recovery from COVID-19. If governments will work against their instinct, everything that Ben Gurion did was against the conventional wisdom. He wanted to establish the IDF against conventional wisdom. He wanted to establish the state of Israel. He was a minority view at the beginning. He wanted to establish Israel bonds in 1951. He approached a few American Jews and he said, let's sell bonds. People will invest in Israel's future. People looked at him like he was crazy. He said, what future? What are you talking about? You have nothing. What future? You have sand, sand, and more sand. What are you selling exactly? And he was selling confidence in Israel's ability to overcome the hurdles. And that's the type of leadership that we need today all over the world. We need people to understand that the way to get out of this is by working against your instinct. If your instinct is to avoid debt and to cut budget, do exactly the same. Exactly the opposite. Invest in infrastructure, invest in predictive medicine, but we can have a whole different conversation about that. This is the projection of Israel's growth. By 2048, Israel is projected to have between 16 to 17 million people. Tel Aviv is projected to be the major hub with nearly 7 million people. Haifa is going to be the second largest hub, according to the projections of the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics, and Jerusalem will be the third largest hub, which means that if you have extra money and you're looking to invest in real estate, it looks like Haifa is the place, and not necessarily Beersheba, like a lot of people think, but Beersheba also is a great investment. What was the main catalyst for Israel's success? Consider this. The year is 1945. We live in a different world, different technology, right? There is not even facsimile, right? The number one agent of mass media was the human rumors, word of mouth was the way news traveled in those days. Even if you printed something in the paper, it didn't mean that the paper was going anywhere. So it took time for people to fully understand the scope and the magnitude of what had happened in Europe. This we have to understand. It took time. It wasn't immediate like today. It wasn't that someone was turning on the radio or the television and was able to get a full picture. And so just as we were beginning to understand what happened in Europe, 1945, when, and still the British mandate blocked entry between 45 to 48. Many of the people that survived the Holocaust were kept in camps, as you know, and were not allowed to come in. Yet we are beginning to understand the scope of the disaster. Just as we are beginning to understand that, and you could say that this is the weakest point in our recent history, just as we begin to fully realize what happened, the Arab world makes a decision to deploy and enact the Arab economic boycott. What does it mean? It means that they are determined to continue the work of trying to eliminate the Jewish people, only this time using economic sanctions. And so that you'll understand how determined they were, they built a mechanism which officially still exists. It's called the Supervising Committee. Its offices are in Damascus, and it's a monitoring committee that their job is to monitor the world who's doing business with us. And the idea was to cover the entire world by implementing 3 levels of boycott. Primary boycott, meaning you can't do business with Israel directly, and tertiary and secondary and tertiary levels, basically covering the whole world. The problem wasn't those who explicitly complied with the boycott. The problem that we had was those who implicitly complied with the boycott. I want you to know that most big American brands shied away from Israel. until the mid 1980s because of the Arab economic boycott. The exceptions were TWA and Coca-Cola and companies like that, but we didn't have any American car maker in Israel. We did not have, and we still don't have, any major American hotel chain. Consider this, the Marriott, which is owned by a Mormon family, doesn't have not even one Marriott in Israel. They do own the Ritz-Carlton, but it's not under the name Marriott. They had one time in Nazareth for a couple of years. They built the Marriott and then closed it down. And I could give you many examples. That was the biggest problem that we had. Not those who explicitly said we comply. Now, Israel's reaction to the Arab economic boycott was very interesting and should be learned and studied in every university in the world. And the reaction was based on three principles. The first was the idea that we have to develop markets that are not immediate. In other words, we have to develop markets outside of our region. If you ever wondered why Israel is competing in basketball, or how come Israel won the European Championship in basketball, because last time we checked, Israel was part of Asia. Israel was rejected out of Asia, as you know, and we're now competing in Europe. And these are all, if you may, repercussions of that same old Arab economic boycott of 1945 that then was translated in different forms into international arenas such as the United Nations and UNESCO and UNICEF and so on and so forth. So the first reaction was, we need to develop markets elsewhere, where the decision was to emphasize on Europe. And indeed, until this very day, Europe is Israel's largest trade partner. A lot of people don't know that. Also, Ben Gurion, again, it was his idea to try and break the Arab opposition by creating alliances with the largest Islamic nations. So Israel developed very strong ties with Turkey. And again, despite of the tension, the diplomatic tension between the two nations, trade between the two nations is still going on very, very strong. In fact, if you look at the decade of 2000, 2010, the trade between Israel and Turkey actually tripled during that time. And at the time, part of the plan was also to establish very strong ties with Iran. That worked until 1978, 1979. So that was the first principle. The second principle was to make sure that Israeli economy is not based on hard commodities, but rather on something that cannot be destroyed, namely human knowledge. And that was really the foundation of the startup nation that you see today. So if there's one thing that we can say about the Arab economic boycott, is that those who try to suffocate Israeli economy, when you look at them today, where are they today? They're lagging way behind Israeli economy in terms of their performance. GDP per capita in Israel is fast approaching the European standard, which is about $44,000 a year. Israeli GDP per capita is probably more than double or the GDP per capita of our neighbors combined. That's what happened since the Arab economic boycott. And Israel was forced to create an invincible economic structure, because you can destroy a building, you can destroy an oil well, but you cannot destroy an idea. And Israeli economy is based on ideas. It's based on people coming up with new ideas, coming up with new products that change the world, and nothing can destroy that kind of creativity. And I think that's the biggest gift that we have, and we'll talk about that in a second. Just to give you an example, and it's a story that a lot of people don't know, that Albert Einstein, the great Albert Einstein, who was a Zionist his entire life, was one of the original founders of the Hebrew University and served as its first chairman of the board. As a lot of people don't know that story, which is one of the things that I tried to do when I was in my position as the head of Brand Israel, I tried to tell the story of Einstein and say, look, if someone like Einstein believed in what we were doing, we better take advantage of it. But look at what happened since Einstein got involved. And he was also instrumental in the creation of the Technion. Um, there is an index in Shanghai that ranks the top 500 universities in the world. It's the standard of the industry. And according to the Shanghai Index, we have in Israel 10 research universities. 6 of them, and you see the list right here, are consistently ranked in the top 500 in the world, which is an incredible achievement for a country our size. But not only that, of the 6 that you see here, 4, the top 4 are consistently ranked in the top 200 in the world. The top 2 are consistently ranked in the top 100 in the world. And every year we have one in the top 50. Usually it's the Hebrew U, but last year was Technion, which is an amazing achievement if you think about it. A country of 9 million people is producing so many universities in the list of the most elite universities in the world. Yeah, so that you'll understand the scope. In the United States, you have 5,500 universities. We have only 10. That's the difference. And we have 6 of the 10 consistently ranked in the top list in the world, which is an incredible achievement. And the way they select them, obviously, is by the number of academic citations, by the number of publications, and so on and so forth. And only recently, the Hebrew University won a very prestigious award in mathematics. Another example of how leadership has sometimes to work against conventional wisdom. When the State of Israel was founded, the biggest existential threat to the Zionist enterprise was lack of water. It wasn't necessarily the aggression of our neighbors, it was a big threat, but no water, no life. And for many, many years, although desalinization was known as a technology, economists were telling us that it's not cost effective, that it's actually cheaper to buy water from Turkey or to buy water from elsewhere, and obviously to completely drain out the Sea of Galilee, it was cheaper to do that than to produce our own water. And I think it was under Ariel Sharon's government that the government made a decision that was against its own instinct. And that was to create debt by investing in 5 different desalination plants along the Mediterranean. They were then operated by independent companies that had to compete for the tender. But the result is that today, Israel is fully sufficient when it comes to self-sufficient when it comes to water. We are independent. We are producing all the water that we need and more. What does it mean more? I'll give you an example. And again, this was a decision made by Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. You know, Israel signed the peace treaty with Jordan in 1994. Part of the peace treaty with Jordan is that Israel has to transfer a certain amount of water to Jordan every year because of the fact that Israel is able to produce all the water that it needs now. We are able to give the Jordanian more than we have to. And it was Ariel Sharon's decision to give them more than we had to. And today, that water makes a big difference for the Jordanians that have to support, on top of their 4.8 million people, another 1.2 million Syrian refugees that settled along the borderline between Syria and Jordan. And so indirectly, Israeli water is aiding Syrian refugees. It's, again, a little known story. Energy. For many, many years, we viewed our strategic dependence on other countries, most famously Egypt, as a strategic impairment. It was not a good thing for Israel to depend upon a former foe like Egypt for its energy. And the conventional wisdom was that we are the land of milk and honey, but not the land of oil and money. And thank God this changed when huge discoveries of natural gas and oil were made in the Mediterranean. I cannot even begin to tell you how this changes Israel's strategic positioning in the region and in the world to go from a situation of a country that is dependent on the goodwill of others to a position of becoming an exporter of energy. It's a big change, and so far so good. We're hoping that that the crisis will not dilute the impact of those discoveries. But there are many elements and variables in this equation that we have to wait and see. But from a strategic point of view, great news for the state of Israel, great news for the Jewish people. Famously, we spoke about creativity. Let me. This is what you see on the stage. Here is just one of many dance groups in Israel. But I wanted to say this about creativity, and I will then sum it up and open this for your questions. The number one commodity today in the world, the number one human asset is creativity. Societies and economies are being judged by their ability to adapt very quickly to technological changes, to allow people to develop ideas and turn them into products. Israel today is one of the leading conceptual products producers in the world, right? I don't have to tell you, many of you are in the market and you know that Israel is number 3 in terms of the number of companies traded on NASDAQ, which is an inconceivable achievement if you think about it. A tiny country like Israel has more companies traded on NASDAQ than, let's say, India or Germany or Japan. Unbelievable achievement. We have more scientific papers published per capita every year in this country than any other nation in the world. And so the level of creativity that exists in Israel is unprecedented, and it stems from 2 different sources. The first is the fact that we had to face challenges that were unprecedented. And we all know the cliche of necessity is the mother of all invention. And the second reason, of course, is our Jewish tradition, which makes us very unique in the terms that Judaism gives you the permission to ask questions, to challenge authority, and to refuse to accept limitations. When you look at the story of the state of Israel, Israel at 72, that's the line. If there's one thing I'd like you to remember from this presentation is this: the refusal to accept limitations. That's the story. HaTorah kula al regel achat. Thank you very much. And at this point, I'd like to open the discussion and take some of your questions. And I don't know, Rabbi, how you'd like to handle this. You want me to answer from the screen, or you want me to let you read the questions?
Whether you prefer.
Why don't you, as the leader of the community, take the lead on this?
Okay, sure. So first, we wanted to thank you for your presentation. As always, your words are eloquent, insightful, and wise, and you are poised the representative of the State of Israel. It's a great honor to have you address us this evening. The first series of questions has to do with the new government. Various questions about what your view of a new government, how it's going to work exactly, what Prime Minister Netanyahu's role would be when Gantz is Prime Minister, questions about the ministries. If you could give us a little bit of your understanding about this, unusual and I believe unprecedented reality, how the government's going to work in the next term.
Yeah, so as you know, everybody was trying to avoid a 4th round of national elections, and then with the COVID-19 crisis, that really energized the two parties to engage and to produce an agreement. Now there is an agreement, but there hasn't been any announcement yet about the portfolios or the positions. So we will have to wait and see in the coming days. But it looks like that Gantz, with only 19 seats, is getting full parity in the relationship with Likud and Netanyahu, which is a big achievement on his part. But it looks like he's going to get the ministry portfolio, and Gabi Ashkenazi, his partner, is going to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And other than that, I think it's too early to determine how this whole thing is going to work. We'll have to wait and see. There are some legal challenges and legal hurdles. Um, we have to remember that the basic fact hasn't changed. Netanyahu doesn't have a majority of 61 seats. So with all the, uh, he has a big achievement in the sense that he was able to break his opposition into pieces, but those pieces are still not going to vote for him. He still doesn't have the 61, and in political terms, he suffered 3 straight losses. The inability to form a government with 61 seats or more, in his eyes, is a failure, and that's the price that he has to pay. He has to share the power with the other contender.
Thank you. You mentioned how the population of the Jewish population in the land of Israel is predicted to grow at great numbers, but the Arab population is also growing significantly. If you could kindly give your perspective how you understand that to play out, where there will be a very large percentage of the significant percentage of the population will be Arab as well.
Yeah, but historically, when you look at the Arab population in Israel, we have to make a very clear distinction between them and the Palestinians. And although many of them will tell you that they identify politically and ideologically with the goals of the Palestinian national movement, in practice, they want to be loyal Israelis. In fact, studies show consistently they're actually very proud to be Israelis, especially now during this crisis, the COVID-19. They're in the front lines. The nurses, most of the nurses, most of the pharmacologists in Israel, most of the emergency ER staff, these are all members of the Arab sector. And they've been in the front lines, and they've been taking care of Holocaust survivors and so on. So the issue here is how to integrate them into the society in such a way that doesn't inflict harm on the society, meaning how to integrate them into this great hub of creativity, the startup nation, how to make sure that Arab women that get a diploma don't have a problem with their spouses to go out and work, and to get them to use credit cards. It's as simple as that. Sometimes that's the problem. They're out of the economic cycle because they're still working in cash, and so on and so forth. So this is going to be the challenge. They're not posing a geopolitical challenge to Israel. In fact, when you look at what's happening within the Arab society, they want very much to be part of Israeli society. And so I'm actually very optimistic about the future of that relationship, which I can't say about the Palestinians. That's a whole different story. What do you do with a reluctant counterpart that doesn't want to reach a deal? That's a very, very frustrating situation. If we have any lawyers on the call that found themselves in this situation, that's very frustrating. So that's where we are with the Palestinians. So I'm not really that concerned about the Arab population. And when you see how they're functioning now, it's actually pretty beautiful.
Thank you. Concerning that last point you mentioned, Land for Peace is a very practical, logical potential way of resolving the dilemma, being that, as you mentioned, the masses in the country perhaps have lost faith in that being a reality to solve the conflict. What do they think potentially, what type of vision do the masses have, if any, of how to solve the conflict in the future?
You mean on the Israelis or the Palestinians?
The Israelis, meaning Israelis, we said before, the 3 offers, many of them very much believed in Land for Peace, but then they became to the understanding that the Palestinians have to agree to that. So that presented a shift in the political arena, as you explained so insightfully. So what now in the masses, if you ask the masses, take a survey of the country, how they think the conflict could be resolved, what ideas are they throwing around to actually solve it?
So there are no new ideas. The situation is very peculiar. You will ask the Israelis, what's your preferred solution? Most Israelis will tell you it's the two-state solution. But if you ask the very same people that said that the two-state solution is the preferred solution, what is the likelihood of this to happen? And you get exactly the same majority. Most of them are not, they don't think it's going to happen. And so that's a very peculiar situation. There is no other plan. There is no other plan. The only plan is to divide. Why? Because if we absorb them, we're changing the demographic balance and not in a good way for us. So it's a very big dilemma. It's a big dilemma that corresponds with the basic tenets of Zionism. What's the purpose of us being here? What's the purpose? And we have to stay true to our purpose. So I think most Israelis, if you ask them, they'll tell you, well, in the perfect world, we'd like them to stay there and would like to stay here, and let's keep a good neighborly relations, and you do your thing and we do our thing, you don't bother us. But we know it's not working. And the Gaza experience is teaching us that it's not going to work as long as the radicals are the ones who are setting the tone on the other side. So unlike many people, the Israelis don't think that time is on our side, yet there's nothing we can do. It's very frustrating. For the time being, the Palestinian issue is off the table internationally. And President Trump has a lot to do with it by the fact that he moved the embassy to Jerusalem and so on. Even the Europeans are less engaged in this. And I think that the main reason is because of the fact that at the end of the day, the Palestinians have to live with the repercussions of their own actions. And that's exactly what's happening now. And, even within the Arab world, it's a very interesting thing. Even within the Arab world, the Palestinians, the plight of the Palestinians has never been so marginal, never been so much, pushed to the sidelines. When you look at Saudi Arabia's relationship with Israel, when you look at Egypt's relationship with Israel, with the Gulf countries, it's incredible to see. And everybody's eager to do business with Israelis. Everybody's eager to do business with them.
And two more questions. We understand that no agreement can be made with the radicals, but the average Palestinian living in the West Bank, the hardworking, trying to support their family, what is their perspective? There may be radicals in the group that spoil it, but what is the current attitude of the everyday working family?
So, the average Palestinian, just like any other person in the world, what they want is what everybody wants, to be able to put food on the table and to provide for their families. And unfortunately, they suffered from acute lack of leadership. It didn't start with Abu Mazen. It did not even start with Arafat. It started before. When you look at, as I call it, the book of mistakes, there's not even one mistake in the book that they did not make, including the way they communicate themselves to the world. Even from a simply marketing point of view, they made every mistake in the book. So unfortunately, we know that the Palestinians, the vast majority of them, would like to have normal lives. We know that. But they really don't have a voice in the Palestinian conversation because the Palestinian political system is built differently. You know that until this very day, they barely have a court system. Their law enforcement is very weak. And the conversation is very radical, unfortunately. Even their textbooks are still very radical. Everything is political. The political leadership is selling the masses hollow slogans with no, they still teach their children that one day they will return to their homes in Jaffa and Haifa. So that's a very difficult obstacle to overcome when the leadership is not there. And sometimes leadership has to make tough decisions. Again, I'll give you the example of 1948. The Israeli government's first decision was to establish the Israel Defense Forces. Now, a lot of people look at it and say, what's the big deal? It was a very big deal because it meant that four different military, paramilitary organizations that acted independently, that had their own command element, that had their own equipment, they had to dissolve and become one. They had to merge. And you have to, this was such a big trauma. I don't have to tell you, you all heard the story of the Altalena, but beyond the story of the Altalena, a lot of people don't know the drama that happened within the Haganah. The Haganah was based on two elements. That you had the rank and file membership of the Haganah, so that you'll have the numbers, so that you'll understand what we're looking at. So the war started with 50,000 soldiers, ended with about 60,000 soldiers. The vast majority of them came from the Haganah. Within the Haganah, there was a group of 6,000 men of the Palmach, which was the elite unit of the Haganah. Names like Yitzhak Rabin, Moshe Dayan, and those guys. Igal Alon, they were the Palmach. Then he had Menachem Begin's Irgun, which was about 2,500 people. And then you had Yitzhak Shamir's Stern Gang, which was about 1,500 people at its peak. So the vast majority of the military force was Haganah and Palmach. But the rivalry between Palmach and Haganah was tremendous. A lot of people talk about Menachem Begin's Irgun's rivalry, but the rivalry between, and until the 1980s, until that rivalry affected Israeli politics until the 1980s and well into the 1990s. Believe it or not, that same rivalry between, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, that was where it started. So leaders have to make decisions like that sometimes. And the Palestinians never had that leadership that will force Hamas and Islamic Jihad to cease fire, that will face their opposition. There is no precedent in the history of any national movement in history. You will not find a precedent to that a national movement wasn't willing to face its own opposition from within. Never happened. It's the first time it happened with the Palestinians, and that's the main reason why they can't move forward.
Thank you. Final question. No one really knows how long the COVID-19 epidemic is going to continue on throughout the world. You mentioned that tourism is the largest source of revenue for the state of Israel. And no one's going to visit Israel if they're going to have to be quarantined for 2 weeks upon arrival. And with so many people out of work, you mentioned domestic tourism as well, that's also going to be limited. So how could Israel possibly survive an extended closure, worldwide closure, or if this thing, God forbid, goes on for another 6 months, a year, who knows? How could Israel survive such an extended period of time with their largest source of revenue drying up?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. We don't know the answer to that. We do know that Israel entered the crisis with a lot of cash. And so we are economically in a good position. The country has money. We have money. What governments will have to do all over the world is to pour money into their own economies. It's the New Deal all over again. And governments that will not do that will not survive. So working against their instincts, leaders will have to invest heavily in infrastructure, especially in healthcare infrastructure, meaning in Israel, we have acute shortage of hospitals and hospital beds. But even beyond that, think about predictive medicine. This is the time to create predictive medicine infrastructure, meaning when the next pandemic hits, and undoubtedly it will hit one day, then we will be able to identify very quickly the people that are susceptible to that type of virus and protect them. If we knew how to do that, we could have avoided the general lockdown that destroyed the economy, because isolation as a remedy is not sustainable, as you pointed out. So what Israel is going to do, I don't know. It depends on how quickly we will learn more about the virus. Right now, we don't know enough to change the quarantine rules. We do know that they're working on a vaccine. I don't think, I mean, we have to understand that I'm not a doctor, but I know enough to say that the best that we can hope for is a vaccination, right? There is no cure for such a thing. And people say that it's not going to happen within the next year or two. So we will have to live with social distancing. And I'd like to introduce to the conversation for you a new terminology, also informational distancing. Try to stay away from too much information. Information overload is a big hazard. And so we will try to open the domestic tourism arena first because it will get the machine going. I don't know what's going to happen with the air travel industry. Israel here is in a built-in disadvantage because people cannot use their cars to come and see us. They can, you know, if you think about Europe, domestic travel in Europe is something that is definitely doable even now within the framework of the nuclear family. You take your family in one car, you don't expose yourself to other people, and you can travel, right? As long as the hotel rooms are announced clean and so on. If everything is sterilized, then you can travel even now. But here, where are you going to travel? If you want to come, if you want to take your car and you live in Italy and you want to come and visit us in Israel, you can't do that. And so it's a big problem for us. We're isolated physically from the world. The only way in is by sea or by air, and I don't see that changing very, you know, in the foreseeable future. So, as I said before, luckily we have the financial resources to support the economy, but I don't know for how long this is going to you know, I don't know if this is going to be enough for a long time.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Um, we really appreciate your time. You should get some rest. Please go back to sleep. We wish you a mazal tov on your daughter's engagement. And please, God, we bless you of only health and happiness and continued strength to represent the Jewish people in the state of Israel with such poise and eloquence for many, many, many years. We appreciate your time, and we especially appreciate what you do for our beloved country.
Thank you so much. Anything for Fifth Avenue Synagogue, anytime.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a
Bye-bye.
good evening. Good night. Bye-bye.